My section of our presentation is going to be on teaching spelling to native English speakers. Primarily here in America is kind of what I'm going to focus on as well. So, what spelling instruction looks like here in America, these probably look really familiar because most of us did these as kids. Um, so the first one that we have, it just says choose the word, which one that is spelled correctly, and then rewrite it. The second one is having kids practice their vowel combinations and which ones are correct and go along with the image. And then the last one I think is really, really cute. It's just called My Ick Words. And so they have to write the word in the blank that ends in ICK that corresponds with the first half of the sentence and also with the images at the bottom. So these are really common ways that spelling is instructed here in the United States. And a lot of spelling instruction really hasn't changed. A lot of the same stuff is still being used from when we were younger, which was going on 20 years ago now for most of us, and even beyond that. And with that, can kind of come its problems, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So, this is what spelling looks like now in America. So, I got this from this source from JSTOR from UCO's library database, teaching spelling in the primary grades by Steve Grimm, who is kind of the head honcho of this study. And he said in his article that spelling is most effective when taught in the primary grades. That teaching spelling in the primary grades at these young ages of between probably around 4 and 7 is when it's most critical. We hear the term critical period a lot when it comes to psychology. And this kind of has the same implication of students during this time really, really, really need to learn their spelling because if they don't, it has drastic effects for the rest of their education. And in this study, he basically got together a group of teachers and he surveyed and studied what instructional strategies they used to teach spelling, what activities they used, how often they used them, and the impact that they had on their students in their classroom. And these are some of the things that he found that I just felt were worth mentioning and putting out there. On average, of all the teachers that he studied, about 90 minutes per week was spent on traditional spelling instruction. And that is a lot for one content area per week in the classroom. So there's a lot of time being devoted to spelling here in America currently to our native English speakers and natives in the classroom. The most common way that spelling was used for instructionally wise, was 90% of teachers studies expected their students to master a list of words each week. I had this almost every single week when I was in elementary school. You get a list of words, and by the end of the week, you are supposed to know how to spell those words, and you have a quiz. 90% of the teachers in this study went by this method. Instructional activities. So the most common instructional activities that the teachers use, 46% of them use spelling games. Whereas on the other end of that, on the contrasting side, only 5 to 8% use computers to aid in spelling instruction. I found that to be very surprising. This study came out in 2008, and even though technology is even more advanced now in 2021 than it was in 2008, technology was still widely and deeply influencing education. And so I found it kind of surprising that only 5 to 8% of the teachers in this study used computers to aid in their spelling instruction. And then in instructional strategies, 46% taught based off of spelling rules. So the majority, this was the highest number, taught basically like kind of teaching from the textbook. We've all had those teachers and professors who teach straight from the book, and that's essentially the method that these teachers used. And then again, contrasting on the opposite side of that, only 18% used phonological awareness. And when they did, it was very, very minimum. And this has its downfalls. These instructional strategies and these activities that not only this group of teachers, but teachers everywhere use, have their downfalls when instructing native English speakers here in America. So those downfalls, kind of summed up in a statement coming from Steve Graham from that study, are that so many students fall in the cracks from lack of differentiation. This mode of teaching spelling that comes from just going over the rules and memorization makes it to where students can easily fall through the cracks for a number of reasons. They fall behind just because they don't understand. They fall behind because of situational factors, where they live, their home life circumstances. All of these things play in part to how they learn. And these types of methods of teaching our students here in America that are native English speakers, which is the general population, for the most part, they fall in the cracks because they aren't being differentiated with their instruction. Teachers aren't recognizing that they need something different. And so he just kind of points out that if spelling is not effectively learned, the composing process of writing is compromised. So things like word choice, if a student doesn't know how to spell a lot of words, they're not going to use a lot of words in their writing. This is something that in my 8th grade class that I see a lot at my clinical site. And then getting ideas from processing memory to working memory, because having to figure out how to spell words is such a taxing process on a student, it can basically cloud the brainstorming process of writing, and they can forget what they're even writing about because they're so focused on learning what the words mean or learning how to spell the words. Kind of a big one that Graham also states is, if spelling is not effectively learned, students avoid writing. They develop a negative mindset. They feel like they can't do it because every single time they end up frustrated. And then on the reading side of things, if spelling is not effectively learned, it makes the text harder to read, and it devalues the text message. If a student is focusing so much on recognizing these words and spellings that they've never seen or understood before, they're not focusing on what the text is actually saying. So this traditional type of instruction that allows for more students to fall in the cracks and to not learn their spelling, these are kind of the results of those students falling in the cracks. This is kind of what we see happening to those students who are being taught by traditional spelling instruction, and it's just not working for them. So where does phonetic spelling fit in? So another source, George Brumel, this source is from 1907, so it's really, really old, but it has a lot of really relevant information, and that's exactly why I included it. He says that phonetic spelling is essentially a great source for the students both falling behind and for all students in general. Our spelling, the way that we spell things in English, it's all on a phonetic basis. And generally teachers, instructors, especially the ones in the previous study, they did go over a little bit of phonetics in their instruction, but the big chunk of it was rules, memorization, rehearsal. So he basically says that phonetic spelling is a great way to start these kids at in the primary grades. That is very, very helpful to aid in eventually doing standardized English spelling. He says that phonetic spelling presents words in a very basic format. They look exactly as they sound, with the variations presented from standardized spelling being shown as a branching off of that basic phonetic form. quote, the child taught with phonetic spelling would mentally see this straight line, which that straight line being the phonetic spelling, and the variations from it would be striking to him. So those variations would be those standardized English spellings, those formal spellings. So he says, all in all, that phonetic spelling is a great starting point to getting to regular standardized English spelling. He basically says that starting with English spelling allows them to get comfortable with the words, allows them to get very, very familiar with the words. And then as their instruction goes along and it gets more complex and it gets harder, they start to see words in standardized English that look incredibly similar to the ones that they already know in phonetic English. It makes it a lot easier to identify. It makes it a lot easier to understand how certain letter combinations, how certain sounds match certain letter combinations in standardized English spelling. And he says, quote, a large part of the words they will recognize readily by their resemblance to what is now familiar to them, and most of the rest they can get by study and attention to the context. And in a few months, with less help than what the children usually get from a teacher, they will read standardized English as fluently as phonetic. So he's basically saying that phonetic spelling, starting these kids in these primary grades with phonetic spelling instruction, kind of fills in those cracks. It kind of gives them one more of a scaffold, more of a starting point. Instead of just nailing in all of these rules, it allows them a simpler way to get comfortable with the words, to get comfortable with the sounds, and then as instruction goes, start bringing in that standardized English spelling, and they're more ready to learn that spelling. So this is just some examples of what phonetic spelling looks like. The first one is just kind of an example of what it really actually is. You can see like the word apple in the corresponding English words. That would be like the standardized English word that kids at that age may not know how to spell, but they may be able to recognize it when it's spelled in the phonetic word example of AIPL. And so when they see those two words side by side as their instruction goes along, they're better able to recognize that, hey, this is the same word. Here's how the letters and the sounds from the phonetic spelling transfer over to the standardized spelling. And then the second one is just kind of an activity that I really, really like that a teacher used in a classroom. Welcome to the dictionary pronunciation. So in the left-hand column, it shows the word as spelled in standardized English spelling. And then on the right, it gives the phonetic spelling from a dictionary, and they have to match them. So that's also just bridging the knowledge that they have already, that they would have already from phonetic spelling instruction into their more increasing standardized English instruction. So phonetic spelling really bridges that gap for a lot of students that fall in the cracks, and it is not used enough.
The topic that I researched was focused on ESL adult learners. All of the research that I used was based on native Spanish speakers and a predominantly Latin American background. Both resources I used were based in New York, which is important to note because of the variety of English dialects and the subjects were exposed to. Phonetic variation refers to the way ESL learners receive different dialects and their intelligibility of each variant. Research found that adult English learners at 3 levels of proficiency differed in their opinions of whether the English of native speakers would be easier to understand than that of other foreign beginning level speakers. Beginner level English learners claim that other foreign students are easier to understand than native English speakers. Intermediate levels found in general native speakers easier to understand. Advanced preferred standard English. The variations of these results suggest that phonological differences indicate a difficulty in the way English should be taught. A phonetic approach might help some ESL learners but might not be so helpful to others. The article explains that survival English has been accepted widely as a means of integrating immigrants into the American society quickly. not only in terms of language acquisition, but also in cultural and educational adjustments and survival. This approach confronts the learner's problems of comprehending linguistic rules and applying them to various situations while dealing with the shock of living in a new cultural environment, which can be confusing and sometimes hostile. In order to understand such ESL experiences and adjustments, three themes are investigated in the article's research: educational, linguistic, and cultural adjustments. Educational adjustments refers to the difficulties encountered by limited English proficient adults who are acquiring both a second language and an initial literacy in classroom setting. Students in adult ESL classes differ dramatically in their linguistic, cultural, educational, and employment backgrounds in the knowledge, skills, and information they bring to the classroom. They also differ in their exposure to and experience with various aspects of the U.S. education and employment. They may be recently arrived refugees, immigrants who have been here for several years, or long-term residents whose families have lived in the U.S. for generations. They may come from a culture with limited literacy tradition, for example, a pre-literate culture. They may have been exposed to minimal literacy through a few years of education, or could be quite literate and educated in their first and other languages, but still need to add to their English. Linguistic adjustment refers to the process of literacy consciousness as one where people must become aware of their day-to-day conditioning in order to build on a strong foundation for their role in society. Adults have agendas for literacy that may be equally important to them in the long run, like supporting children in their social, moral development as human beings, helping grandchildren learn the story of their past, creating circumstances in which their children can succeed without rejecting who they are and where they come from, and ensuring their children will stay connected and take care of them when they grow old. Among forces that help participants improve literacy are helping their children with their homework, being able to answer the phone, being able to read the mail, and being able to speak with an English speaking professional. Cultural adjustment is experienced as people attempt to deal with the shock of living in a new cultural environment. Among the deterring factors are being mixed level classes, fear of speaking, fear of ridicule, lack of childcare, classes being too difficult, and programs being too demanding and not offering flexibility in scheduling. The nature of ESL literacy is very complex because it depends on the literacy of two languages. Adults learn continually and informally as they adjust to rule changes, language needs, cultural demands, and other adaptations. Adult learners are both embedded in their lifelong cultures and bring a wealth of information and experience to the classroom. These experiences can be used to make sense of the new knowledge and skills that they are trying to acquire. In ESL learning, the freedom to move across cultural boundaries results in the negotiation of choices, rather than being bound by strict norms. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Kelsey Bird, and I'm talking about teaching language to students with disabilities. Alexis is also talking about language with children with disabilities. I was supposed to do adults, but there was just not a lot I could find about adults specifically. There was a lot about just students in general, so I kind of took a different take from her, but that's why you're seeing it's kind of similar, but not really. Okay. So, one of the articles that I found had a really interesting quote that I wanted to share. And I think some people from other presentations kind of talked about it, so I thought that was cool. Not the same one, but it doesn't matter. Okay. The quote is, American schools of the 21st century face the challenge of educating the world's most diverse student body. And I just really liked that it said that, and I felt that it was very true, because not only do public schools in the United States just have so many students, but they also have so many students of various backgrounds, statuses, different, some are ELL, some may have a disability, There's just so much diversity in the public school system in the United States, and I just like that it pointed that out. And it is a challenge when it comes to teaching things. There's just when you have such a variety of students, you have to figure out a way to try to reach as many of them as you can and help them out. But I just wanted to share that quote. So when I was looking into this, like I said, I had some difficulty finding things specifically about adults, so I just wanted to talk about students, just a blank or a broad umbrella of just students in general. But I kind of let the research figure out what I was going to talk about instead of me starting with something really specific. And so this is where I ended up. So I ended up talking about the main focus is just how difficult it is to identify students with LD who struggle in language. There's so many aspects that come with diagnosing. Whoa, that's a hard word. Diagnosing someone with LD, specifically when they have language difficulties, and I'm going to talk about that in this presentation, and then I'll also talk about two teaching strategies for students who do have LD. Okay, so with the increase, so one of the articles that I found said that with this increasing number of students, and then also increasing number of native Spanish speakers, there is an issue with like the identification of appropriate assessment when it comes to LD for those students, just because distinguishing ELL students from ELL students with LD is very difficult, because specifically when the students with LD their main focus is language difficulties, because an ELL student is going to have language difficulties when it comes specifically to the English language. And so there's a lot of issues with that, and as well as a difficulty with students who are deaf and have a language learning disability. Both of those students, ELLs and deaf students, deaf hard of hearing students who have LD, struggle with proper diagnosis. Okay, so majority of students who are deaf struggle with language, and there is an issue distinguishing whether those students are struggling because they are deaf or hearing impaired, or because they have LD. And so hearing individuals with English language learning disabilities can exhibit the same language difficulties as a deaf individual. So it makes a lot of people think that, well, if this deaf individual is showing all the classic signs of language learning disability as a hearing individual, then they must have LD. They must be LD. But that's just not the case. This lack of criteria is partly due to the fact that virtually the same problems that hearing language learning disability students have, so like language forms, structures, and usage patterns, are the same that deaf individuals with or without LD exhibit. So some more difficulties that both have in common are like phonological, lexical, morphological, syntactic, semantic, and on discourse levels. So because of these similarities in language issues, there's so many deaf students who get misdiagnosed with LD just because they also struggle with language. And this particular article doesn't talk about it, but ELLs with LD also struggle with misdiagnosis, because they're having issues with language, so it's just assumed that it must be because they have a language learning disability. Okay, so moving on to strategies, learning strategies. One article that I found talked about 2 specific strategies, being chunking and multisensory. This article specifically talked about students with dyslexia, and helping them learn language. And so chunking subdivides the letters of vocabulary words into different colors. So it could be phonologically or phonetically. It could be with prefix or suffix, in a lot of different ways, and dividing them by different colors to help them understand what makes up that word, and also focus on different parts of the word and how to say it. Also helps them memorize how to spell different words. And then also multisensory strategies, which are some of their examples were writing words in clay, Wikisticks, which I'm sorry did not explain what that was, and then writing in colored sand. And though this article is specifically for students with dyslexia, I think multisensory learning strategies for those who struggle with language could be beneficial for anyone with a variety of severity in their struggle with language, because multisensory is just great for so many different people with disabilities. And so I really liked that I talked about that, because I think that could be beneficial for all ages, and then for a vast variety of disabilities, whether they're learning disabilities or a physical disability. Okay. The next learning strategy that I want to talk about is PALS, which is Peer Assisted Learning Strategies. I think that the name is kind of self-explanatory. And so it's a learning strategy that uses students with and without a learning disability to work with one another to promote learning specifically in language. And so it would be pairing students together in either groups of 2, groups of whatever, some with and some without LD, and having them talk about either read with one another, or talk about a paragraph that they read, or work on vocab words or writing or anything really language related, having them help one another. And this article was specifically about ELLs with LD, and figuring out if PALS was a beneficial strategy for them, which it was, but it said that it was previously already known that it was an effective strategy for native English speaking students with LD. So it seems like PALS is just a really good strategy regardless, and that it helps students gain oral fluency, but even greater than that, a greater improvement in reading comprehension, and that both the students with LD and the students without LD gained from the experience, and showed better test scores. And it just seems like PALS is a really good learning strategy for students in general, but specifically students with LD when it comes to language. It's probably why we get paired up in groups so much, aka this project. But that's all I have for this, my project, my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Dyslexia is one learning disability that contributes to difficulties with spelling. A lot of the time, a child with dyslexia can switch around letters that sound the same when trying to spell them. Children who have dyslexia can also experience difficulties with writing, reading comprehension, decoding words, and phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is basically the ability to recognize the sounds in words. There are quite a few ways that teachers can help children with dyslexia become better at spelling. For example, when they're tutoring children one-on-one, the first thing they should do is figure out where the child is having difficulty. This difficulty could be coming from syllables, phonemes, or the overall orthography of the words. Once the root of the problem has been determined, the child should be made aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are and how the teacher is going to help them. If the teacher is going to help with furthering an understanding of the rules of spelling, exceptions to spelling rules, or spelling combinations, then they should explain that in a way that the child will understand. Another thing teachers can do is make sure the child understands the correspondence between sounds and alphabetical symbols. It might be wise to start out with tasks that deal with phonological awareness. This might mean that they present a word to the child, who then has to disassemble the word at the syllable and sound level. This certain task helps children with dyslexia identify the patterns of spelling at the word's morphological level. It's also wise for the teacher to not overload the child with too many tasks like this at a time. It could create even more confusion and frustration. When helping a child with dyslexia understand the exceptions to spelling rules, a teacher can facilitate learning by exposing the child to the words that apply when reading. This is so that the child can see the word printed out, because oftentimes children who have dyslexia won't have as much exposure to words in print because of their frustration with reading. A good way to expose the child to printed text in a manner that isn't frustrating is by using programs that convert printed text into speech. By using these programs, the child will be able to listen to the text being read out loud while they're following along. Dysgraphia is a different learning disability that actually results from a child developing dyslexia. It's a condition of impaired letter writing by hand, which is just another way to say disabled handwriting. This impaired handwriting can interfere with learning how to spell words in writing and speed of writing text. Someone who has this condition can have a variety of symptoms like an impairment in their handwriting or spelling or both. Some children with dysgraphia struggle with holding their pencil the correct way. It also affects their ability to remember how words are written, which can cause them to make spelling mistakes of a word multiple times in different ways each time. This results in the child struggling even more to get the words from their brain to a paper, either by typing or writing them. There are two strategies that teachers can use to help children with dysgraphia. The first strategy is a compensation strategy, which uses techniques that don't necessarily deal with the problem itself, but instead it focuses on lessening the negative impact on learning. The main goal of these strategies is to get the student to a place where they can fluently perform the tasks they are struggling with. This should allow the student to fully focus on the material that is being worked on. There are quite a few ways that compensation strategies can be performed with children. The first and probably most important one is to fully understand what the variabilities and inconsistencies are in the child's work. Once this is completed, then the teacher is able to provide more personal strategies. So if the child has problems with spelling but gets frustrated easily because of it, then they should modify certain tasks. So when the child has a writing assignment, the teacher shouldn't let them immediately proofread their paper. If they do, then more often than not, the child will read what they wanted to write instead of what they actually wrote. So they should take a break, then proofread their writing. The teacher should also provide a list of things for the child to check so it's not completely overwhelming to the child. This way, they can see the words they have misspelled and be able to figure out how to spell them correctly. The second strategy is the remediation strategy, which provides additional structured practice or reteaching of the skill or concept using specialized techniques to match the student's processing style and need. This strategy involves very specific techniques that assist the child with being able to render words they don't know with adequate phonetic spelling. One of these techniques is to use a phonetic spell checker, but this is only used if the child can spell phonetically and logically. A phonetic spell checker is a handheld device that is able to recognize words using their phonetic sequence rather than the orthographic sequence like a typical spell checker.
Hi, my name is Carson Cribley, and I did my slides over teaching spelling to children who are learning English as their second language. Okay, so for my first slide, I said know their background, and I said the first thing that is the very most important thing to know about teaching children who are learning English as their second language is the fact that it is very dependent on many different factors, especially the background of the student. Some important questions to consider are how similar the language they currently speak and write is to English. Does it follow any similar rules or have any similar sounds? Do they hear English around the house or anywhere else in their learning environment? All of these questions are really important to consider because even though it is true that children will have an easier time learning in a second language when compared to adults, it is also true that they might need different techniques to fully help them connect how the rules of their first language might connect to English easier. Alrighty, so for this next slide, I kind of wanted to address the important tools for understanding English for an ESL student. This is kind of applied for all ESL students because even though I said many different techniques based on their first language, these are the kind of elements that all researchers look towards to see how students are doing and predict where they're going to be struggling in the future. And so I said that the biggest one would be phonological awareness, which is one of the predictors of success with a student's second language. It is defined as the awareness and access to oral codes in language. It's something I'm sure we are all pretty familiar with, especially being in this class. I thought that they did something really interesting in these studies because they would often show the children a picture of the word and ask them to identify the first phoneme in that word. And that really helps students kind of be able to spell better along the way. So that was a huge one, as well as letter knowledge, which I am just now seeing the misspelling, so sorry about that. We also had vocabulary knowledge, paired semantic information with spelling, and analytical skills. So analytical skills was one that I really found was something that I hadn't thought of before. Obviously, it's something that any language would require, but especially for children, I thought it was really interesting because they said that, you know, languages with a heavy leaning on analytical skills to decipher like image or symbols for meaning also translates well to English, where they are obviously putting that right back into a letter instead of a symbol. So I thought that was super interesting. All right. For this research, I primarily looked at one study that seemed to address how spelling and phonetics played a role in teaching Chinese students English as their second language. On this slide, I put up the two most important quotes that I had found in this study. These two really explain that due to the nature of Chinese being a morphosyllabic language, the language can be connected to English phonemes because the children already have a sense of phonological awareness. As I discussed before, it was really in Chinese where they were able to use the symbol and correlate it with the letter kind of easily. So this interesting study also tested 141 5-year-old students in Hong Kong learning English as their second language and found that while there was a little bit of variance in the spelling test of the study, the performance on this task was significantly correlated with phonological awareness, letter knowledge, English vocabulary, and English word reading. This variable was thus analyzed further, and in addition, phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and English vocabulary were significantly correlated with the English word learning along with spelling. So, but I thought that one important thing to note about this study is that many students would have also an abundance of English learning going on outside of school. They noted that parents watching TV shows and reading stories in English were all common for nearly all the students, and so more than likely that also significantly helps students with spelling in the classroom as well. So I think this is something that is super important and I wanted to address in my next slide. One second. And in this slide, I really just wanted to talk about how exactly to help and how exactly what things work the best for students in the classroom. So I wanted to say really that in conclusion, if I was asked, does spelling or phonetics seem more important when teaching ESL students, I would simply say that it seems both work the best when incorporated together into lesson planning. When a teacher considers that a student's background and phonological awareness that they might have already received from their first language, then a teacher can access these other tools like analytical, the vocab, and the letter recognition, all needs to be relied upon which one of those need to be relied upon the heaviest, and then they can kind of tailor from there what the ESL student might need. Along with this, there are several other things that can be done to help ESL children learn and master spelling. One of the most important, of course, is ensuring that they have a way to practice outside of school. And we've seen this, of course, like I said before, in storybooks, maybe in English, definitely parents helping, friends helping, any way that they really can find. And I would also say that one of the most important, of course, as well, is putting up visual markers around the classroom, maybe little signs in English, anywhere that they can look, they're just seeing English and being exposed to it. That way that they always just have that recognition and not really any kind of fear of any words that they haven't seen before. And I would say the last thing is also having frequent spelling tests, because that was something that was incorporated in a lot of these studies, is just frequent spelling testing, obviously to track at where the children are at, where they're going, where they still need help, and going back to the tools to help them. So encouraging all these tools to students and teachers will help the future of ESL children have a smoother transition into spelling and speaking the English language. Thank you very much. Have a great day.